Thank you. I'm the Marklee of Johnston Marklee, and this is Jonathan Oliveris. Of Jonathan Oliveris and Partners. We're delighted to participate in this Miller Prize competition for many reasons. The first and foremost of which is to work in this neighborhood and this town of extremely exemplary architecture examples of modern architecture, not just of the buildings themselves, or how they come together as an environment. The second of which is we are very supportive of this Miller Prize. I think it's very important that this endeavor brings this, shows a new phase of this architecture heritage. And then the third of which is we've been admiring each other's work for a long time and have collaborated before, and this gives us an opportunity to work together. We also want to thank Eric Howler for presenting such a great presentation of the analysis. So it cuts our presentation in half. So we're finished like way ahead of time. So what else is left to say about this space between the library, and the church? Maybe I will say a few things about what we think about the buildings. We certainly admire Elio Saarinen's church, and for us, the Saarinen's church come from a lineage that is a Scandinavian lineage. Scandinavia, a lot of you know, that embraced classicism in the early 20th century, and because of that, modernism came quite late compared to other European countries. But because it came late, it arrived very refined and very mature at the outset. It didn't have that kind of revolutionary seal. This whole evolutionary aspect was already there. And so for us, the First Christian Church is one of these exemplary examples of that. I.M. in more ways than one, is this master of being contextual. He talked about his admiration for the Georgian period, the French cities in the 18th and 19th century, where architects have a shared agenda. It's not about these individual iconic buildings that Eric also mentioned. I don't know if some of you might have seen this TV show, I think Architecture Now, in 1980. Now you can see it on YouTube with Barbara Lee Diamondstein interviewing architects, and one of which was this rare interview, I.M. Pei, where he talked about his admiration for the situation in Florence, where Brunelleschi designed the foundling hospital. 80, 90 years later, Michelozzo designed another building. Sangallo, the elder, designed another building across the plaza that is almost exactly the same as Brunelleschi's, and he said, that's civilized. And now I think we see this example from 1969. It's not exactly the same as Saarinen, but I think in more ways than one, it shows his reverence and how he creates a dialogue. It's almost like Saarinen, placed a chess move, and then I.M. Pei responded. And all the axes that was presented and that was discussed before, the closing of the street to form a plaza and forms this kind of turnaround. And for us, creates this kind of figure ground issue. I.M. Pei did it in brick, continued to break on the plaza, askew the entrance that faces the church, and in a way, the reflection of the glass when you approach the library begins to reflect the grid on the facade of the church, and then you can see through the glass and see the grid of the waffle slab and how that all came together. I'm sure the jury have also seen that yesterday. We think the plaza is so perfect, and we should not do anything to it. It's one of these things that's so well calibrated. Like, why do you want to add another ingredient? But we thought if this is only for 3 months, it's okay.
The other thing that really struck us about the site, obviously, is the Henry Moore, and the late and great industrial designer Richard Sapper. He used to go to the Henry Moore at Lincoln Park in New York City and photograph it in the round. So he would walk all around it and photograph it in 24 kind of increments. And he'd use those photographs as the basis for his teaching at Yale at the summer workshops in Brissaggio. And he would ask the students to basically think of an object as something that's in the round and something that unfolds its character, reveals itself, changes its character as you walk around it and as you experience it in the round. And I think one of the nice things that we found in this relationship between Moore, Pei, and Saarinen was the notion of figure ground, and that's something that we've discussed in our collaborations in the past, is that the architecture really provides a ground, and furniture, the scale that I work at, really engages the figure on a very direct level. So one of the things that the Moor does for us, I mean, we did our own kind of photographic exercise, maybe not quite as thorough as Richard Sapper's, but we were really taken with the framing that happens on this site, and that, you know, Pei frames Saarinen, Moor frames Pei, Moor frames Saarinen, and you have this kind of incredible framing that happens between the different objects and the different sight lines. And we thought that actually encouraging people to walk through, like if we were going to make a contribution to this space, how could we highlight this kind of feature of the space, make people aware of it, and somehow set the tone for viewing and for the idea of walking around and taking in the site as you visit. So in some capacity, what we were doing had to be a visitor center. The other thing that we thought was really strong about the space is something that we're now coming to call the lost living room. It's something that's actually no longer in the living room, but that was intended in the original plans, and it was the furniture that was used in the main floor of the library, and it was intended that this would be a kind of reading lounge. And you can imagine, you know, way before the internet, people would hang out there and bring their books and kind of cozy up. And the night we visited, there are some smaller enclaves on the eastern side of the building where you see students hanging out. And so we thought a really important part of what we do, it's one dimension is viewing, and the other dimension has to be the social dimension, which is to give people a place to sit and read and enjoy each other's company and enjoy potentially books.
So the location of our piece is actually directly across from the Henry Moore sculpture. So in many ways, we try to approximate the scale of the Henry Moore sculpture. We thought the triangulation that the Moore sculpture, together with the entrance of the church and the entrance of the library, actually works really well already. So in many ways, it's a bit like a fourth wheel nested around the trees. But we also want to exemplify some of the views that were quite latent. You know, so there's certain explicit views, like the framing between the arch and then the tower, the framing of the walkway on the west and the campanile itself. But like the corner, the northwest corner or the northeast corner of the library, where you walk underneath the canopy after you emerge from the sidewalk, and then seeing the sculpture and the campanile again. So our piece wants to address some of these more latent views. So height-wise, massing-wise, it's about a cube, like 22 by 22 by 22 feet, approximately close to the height of the Moore sculpture. And I think you can begin, it's this image, you can also begin to see that the benches of Johnston, which we'll describe more in detail, in relationship to the stanchions and the scale of the singular piece of light outside the library. Geometrically, it's very straightforward. The primitive is a marriage between a circle and a square. It really has nothing to do with the site, the geometry. But now I learned that there's this golden section. So there is a golden section, you know. There is a square and a circle in the golden section. So very simple, you know, two volumes stacked on top of one another. We rotate the upper volume so it has a tangential relationship in terms of the curve and then the edge. And then it opens up. It opens up on two sides. So in a way, it forms an opening towards the upper one forms an opening towards the entry to the church, and then the lower one forms an opening towards the Moore sculpture as well as the northwest corner. The roofs are taken out, so in a way, it's an open pavilion. It's really formed by the walls of the space. The views are formed by the walls of the space.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we thought was really important with this image and also with the project was the idea of really framing and providing views and getting people in the mindset of looking at their surroundings. I think it's really for people who sort of walk through here every day. I mean, I have experienced this in my own city all the time. You start to take the things around you for granted somehow. So all of a sudden, you know, the amazing the amazing Schindler House on the other side of the reservoir is just that thing I pass in traffic on my way to get coffee in the morning. And somehow, if we could frame and you know, sort of electrify what's there with these new views, and also provide the kind of missing living room so that you can sit and enjoy this space. One of the things when we were developing this is a concrete bench. It's made with a kind of lightweight, high strength, polymer infused concrete with a factory that specializes this in Oakland, California. It's light enough to ship, and the idea is to really use the site and the context to develop a new piece of furniture. So in a sense, the bench really does have a lot to do with the site. I was really taken with the pews, the church pews that Arrow Saarinen and Charles Eames did in the First Christian Church, which is a kind of Eames, proto-Saarinen furniture. It's really before they became great furniture designers. In that church, they're working with very rudimentary materials and long slabs of locally sourced wood, and somehow that archetype of like the bench and the slab became important. And the other reference for the bench is really the Moore sculpture itself, which sits on two vertical supports and is joined by a horizontal support. And there's this humanist, anthropomorphic quality to the Moore sculpture, which I wanted to bring into the bench. And so you have, later on, we'll look at the bench in a plan view, and you see that it's sort of oriented to point two people towards each other. And so, yeah, here we have different views of different living room scenarios. The bench is freestanding, so it can be moved and reconfigured. It's light enough for two people to carry. We would imagine having as many or as few as would be agreed upon with the library. We think programming for this living room is really important. We talked a little bit about the idea of bringing in things like coffee. There have been music events and concerts here in the past. We think we could have as many as 20 to 30 benches to host a large concert, and as few as 7 to have a kind of define the basic premise of the living room.
I mean, I think the pavilion, the conception of the pavilion really came from this interior view. And how when you're in a room, when you have one side that's open, one always gets drawn to the view itself, and also creating a curve that one always has the cognizant about you in a room that you have a curve behind. It's almost like this amphitheater with natural light coming in from the top. The upper volume is slightly taller than the lower volume, 12 feet by 10 feet. It's slightly top heavy. We are thinking of building this out of a steel frame that's welded. There are 4 pieces of steel frame that are welded, and then they could be bolted together on site. Each piece could be transported by a flatbed. The interior will be cladded in marine grade plywood. Then the exterior will first have a layer of marine grade plywood, and then have a series of overlapping galvanized sheet metal. And we're thinking of using these helical foundation anchors, so it minimizes the contact to the ground. We have to remove a few bricks that could be easily be replaced. And basically, this pavilion has no floor, so it's just all the effort goes into the walls itself.
The production of the bench is done in such a way that it's made of 3 separate castings that are assembled. So the verticals is a single casting. The horizontal seat is with a crossbeam is a third, and then the backrest, or is a second, and the backrest is the third casting. And these parts are light enough to be kind of boxed up, shipped, and then the bench technology uses a polymer. So it's a polymer-infused concrete, which is what makes it light and strong. That same polymer binding allows you to glue the parts together. So using a high-strength kind of industrial fastening epoxy, you can set these things together on site. The other thing we thought of is that there's a certain longevity to furniture. You don't just want to throw it away when you're done. So we thought that this functions as a kind of city bench, which could potentially be given or used elsewhere in the city afterwards, and it has the potential to be anchored to the floor so that it can't be moved. Here in plan view, I just wanted to show you quickly that slight curve of the bench. It sits 2 people, and it points those 2 people just towards each other. Just after the election, I was looking at the kind of electoral map and noticed that this region was very purple. And somehow I thought that means there's a need for conversation and people with, with very differing opinions to kind of meet and have a place to discuss each other. So that actually came in late into the design, was this arc, which sort of points, it creates what we call a conversation bench. This is our last slide.
Yeah, I think when we first started, we're very cognizant about when we first started the design, we're very cognizant about the budget, and the time frame and the nature of this pavilion. And we are thinking $70,000, what can you do? And we thought maybe we can buy a Porsche Macan and park it there for 3 months, and not a fully loaded one, I might add. And then you can drive it, keep it for 10 years before there's some electrical problems. Or we can spend it to build a pavilion for 3 months, but perhaps with benches that we could keep. So we did a cost breakdown. We figured out the pavilion will perhaps cost about $50,000, material and built. I think the steel itself is the largest chunk, $25,000, and then $20,000 for the development and construction of the benches. Depends on how many pieces there will be.
Yeah, and just add a note that this whole project has been so exciting, and exciting enough that we convinced this manufacturer, the state-of-the-art concrete manufacturer in Oakland, who normally does like Apple stores interiors, that they would support this project. So we have roughly $20,000 left in the budget to develop the bench, but I think that we would receive much more than that in terms of corporate support from the manufacturer, which was really exciting. I think that how easy that was to convince them is a testament to how exciting Exhibit Columbus is as a draw.
I also want to add that I think the decision to use galvanized metal in many ways parallel with the Moore sculpture, being 2 metallic pieces in this land of brick, or this plaza of brick and masonry. But I just noticed that I think our buildings speak a lot to the graphic of this. Do you think? Yeah. So I think it's a success. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.
We also have a model.
I'd love to hear how you envision the relationship between the benches and the pavilion. How far-reaching can one take the benches? Can they really scatter all over the city? I mean, do you want to put in place some boundaries, or?
I thought a lot about it, and it was the question of, do they need to be anchored or not? And one of the things I noticed when we were here in September was how there's so many instances, like the Cummins headquarters and just next to the bank, where you have public furniture and public chairs that are out, and I noticed that there's not a theft problem here, which is really, really nice. And I think that speaks to the town, to the informality of the town, to when you go out to any restaurant here with anyone who lives here, they inevitably bump in to their kid's second grade teacher and to their colleague and to the, it's such a tight community. I think you could not have loosely configured benches in downtown Los Angeles, but I think here you can. And I think that the programming is very important. So like here, currently we have like 2 positioned inside of the pavilion so that you could sit and take in some of these views that the pavilion provides. But I think you can also stage certain events if there were to be a music event, or in September there was a kind of reception here with lots of people, and I think the bench, there was nowhere to sit except for the steps. So somehow this just provides, I don't imagine that the benches would sort of wander too far. But I think, it wouldn't be out of the question to say that you'd position one, for another view at the Moore sculpture.
But you would start out with sort of your ideal kind of viewpoints of where you would place the benches? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mark, can you go back to the slide that shows the perspective inside the pavilion? I don't think I even saw that one. Oh. I think there's one there where there's kind of a split view. Yeah, that one. Right. Okay. What's the material on the inside? Is that plywood or is that galvanized as well?
Painted marine gray plywood.
Okay.
Yeah. Only the outside has
Painted.
yeah.
With color to be determined.
You know, I think we designed this to budget. You know, so if during the construction process we know there will be some donors, or we also budgeted quite conservatively. So this is we think the most economical situation that works with the curvature, the basic package. You know, but if we do have some sponsors and certain things could be donated, and we have the budget for it, we would like to think of something else for the interior that makes it more of a smoother material. Our analogy is always like the inside of an abalone shell. It's quite rough on the outside, but inside has this kind of smoothness and iridescence.
You're trying to achieve kind of a lack of material so that
Right.
the focus is on the views.
Right.
Okay.
So the views you see, everything is about material when you look out.
Speaking to views, then the interior space, how high is the first portion? So from this perspective, the closed portion?
10 feet.
That's 10.
Yeah. The second part is 12 feet.
So would there be any moment within the circle, within the cylinder, the implied cylinder, that you could actually see First Christian Church, the
Pardon me?
facade as you collage? here?
Yeah, we think at the corner.
Yeah.
When you sit down, when you sit down on Jonathan's bench, we can see the church. Correct. Yeah.
You're looking up.
Yeah. We also think certainly these openings, one could say viewing machines for you to sit in and look, but also it's something to be looked at. We think particularly like when you're at the entry to the church, when you're elevated, you see an opening directed towards you. I mean, we talked about possibilities of projections inside the space, so you can see it from when you exit the church. We talked about different ways of lighting it. We talked about the possibility of even having strips of fluorescent light in a Dan Flavin way, perhaps. A certain color lights up, a different color lighting down, so you can see the reflection inside the curved surfaces.
No, I would just argue that it's two different views and two different ways of viewing the space.
Yes.
Or the spaces, I should say.
No, very much so.
Could you speak a little bit about viewing the object or the pavilion from other points in the site or in other points in the surrounding context?
Looking at the pavilion, yeah. Well, we know that the competition was for the first project that you've seen is on the other side, so we decidedly turned our back towards it. No. I think we looked in how one approaches the site. How one walks from the western direction, or one walks from the alongside the library towards in the axis of the Campanile. So we wanted to create something a little bit more enclosed. You don't really see what it is, more like a monolithic object. So only at certain points does the pavilion begin to open up. So when you approach in the main direction, you see one of the projects on your right-hand side, and then you just see this kind of building that turns around. But I think the geometry suggests that it's turning in one direction. It's not just a static cylinder. I think this is the small details we try to achieve in terms of aligning the upper object with the lower object and where it protrudes out.
Yeah, there was early on there was really the discussion about this being a kind of visitor center. It is right next to the actual visitor center, which is here, but we thought that this was a kind of visitor center for the eyes, and that if you approach from the real visitor center, you'd approach you're walking south, and you have the Saarinen Tower, which is sort of continued and echoed by the brick pathway, which is here. And that the pavilion is placed exactly at that moment, so it's really the first thing you see when you approach from the visitor center. But from the other side of the street, it was also really important that it have a kind of scale dialogue with more. So again, this sort of figure-ground relationship between pay and more is shrunk in our pavilion, and now the bench is the figure and the pavilion is the ground somehow. Actually, one quick thing I'd add about materiality is that concrete they use it in the stanchions that prevent cars from sort of coming. Apparently a fight broke out here at some point in the 90s, and they added stanchions because people were using it to park before school got out. But the stanchions are concrete, but also the kind of ceiling in the library was at the time a very innovative use of concrete. And so this was another reason, I mean, in addition to weathering the elements and so on, that the choice of concrete was made for the bench.
A little bit about the design of the benches. The building's interesting in that it has this kind of multi-directionality about it, but by putting the backs on the bench, they're very directional. They face one way, as opposed to if they were, for instance, backless and just a kind of slightly curved shape. What was the thinking behind kind of that idea that the benches kind of orient you in a specific way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd sort of quickly refer back to this plan image. I mean, they orient a person in one angle. They orient two people in two slightly different angles. So two people seated next to each other would have two slightly differing views. The backrest is really a social dimension. I mean, it's there to give someone a sense of place, something to lean against, something so that you can sit there for, 20 to 30 minutes if need be. But it's also considering kind of, I mean, I don't love ADA requirements, but you do think about, elderly people and people who might need something to help them get in and out of the seat. I think a backless bench in this situation could be somehow not accommodating or not as socially accommodating.
In terms of the furniture, we talked a lot about how this part-to-whole relationship, how the benches, the slight curvature, we basically could line the curves all within the pavilion itself, so it forms part of this circle. But then when it's out by itself, it suggests a much smaller arch that is maybe more humanist in terms of the scale.
Thank you.
Thank you.